England, 1817. They say lightning never strikes the same place twice, but they also say a child born in a storm carries darkness in her soul. I, Eliza Thornfield, never imagined that a superstition whispered at my birth would shape every moment of my existence, that the thunder that claimed my mother would also claim my future, that society's fear would build walls higher than any manor's stone. But what I really didn't know is that sometimes it takes another soul marked by darkness to see the light within you. This is the story of a woman who refused to let whispers define her destiny, and who found love in the most unexpected of places, in the arms of a man as haunted as she was blessed. But before we dive into this story that challenged everything Regency society held sacred, tell me, from what corner of the world are you watching? Leave your comment, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because this journey promises to be unforgettable. The truth is always more fascinating than fiction. I have often wondered if one can grow accustomed to being feared, not in the way a queen might be feared, with respect and admiration woven through the trembling, but feared as one might fear a black cat crossing one's path, or a mirror cracking at midnight. The kind of fear that is rooted not in what you have done, but in what you simply are. My existence has been defined by a storm I cannot remember. The night of my birth, 23 years ago, was apparently one of biblical proportions, the kind of tempest that sent servants scurrying to check the shutters and made even the bravest men wonder if they had led sufficiently virtuous lives. My mother, Lady Catherine Thornfield, went into labor as the first drops of rain began to fall. By the time the storm reached its crescendo, she had brought me into this world and promptly departed it. The midwife, a woman named Mrs. Grimsby, whose name alone should have warned my father against employing her, declared that I had been marked by darkness, that the storm had been a portent, and that my mother's death was merely the first of many misfortunes I would bring to those around me. She whispered this diagnosis to anyone who would listen, and in a society that thrived on gossip as much as it did on tea and scandal, everyone listened. My father, Sir Richard Thornfield, was a man of science and reason. He had studied at Cambridge, corresponded with members of the Royal Society, and possessed a library that was the envy of scholars throughout the county. He dismissed Mrs. Grimsby's proclamations as the superstitious nonsense they were, but even his considerable rationality could not stem the tide of rumor that swept through our social circles. I grew up aware of my peculiar status, long before I understood what it truly meant. I noticed the way other children's mothers would pull them closer when I approached at church. I observed how invitations to birthday celebrations and garden parties somehow never found their way to our household. I learned to interpret the subtle shifts in conversation when I entered a room, the way laughter would die just a fraction too quickly, the way eyes would dart away just a moment too fast. My father did his best to compensate. He educated me himself, refusing to send me away to school where I might face even crueler treatment. He taught me mathematics and literature, philosophy and science. He encouraged my questions, and never once suggested that my gender or my reputation should limit my intellectual curiosity. In his study, surrounded by leather-bound volumes and the comforting smell of pipe tobacco, I was simply Eliza, not the cursed child, not the girl who killed her mother, just a young woman eager to learn. Mrs. Dalton, our housekeeper, became something of a surrogate mother to me. She was a practical woman from Yorkshire, who had no patience for superstitious nonsense. When I was 10 and came home in tears after overhearing Lady Marchmont tell her daughter to stay away from me lest my curse prove contagious, Mrs. Dalton sat me down in the kitchen and spoke to me with a frankness I desperately needed. She told me that people fear what they do not understand, and that they would rather blame a helpless infant for a natural tragedy than accept that sometimes the world is cruel and random. She said that my worth was not determined by the opinions of people too small-minded to see beyond their own prejudices. Then she gave me a slice of her famous lemon cake and sent me back to my books. I have carried her words with me through the years, though I confess there were times when they provided cold comfort. By the time I reached marriageable age, the situation had become almost comical in its absurdity. I had no prospects whatsoever. Not because I lacked accomplishments. I could play the pianoforte tolerably well, spoke French and Italian with some fluency, and had read more widely than most gentlemen of my acquaintance. Not because I lacked beauty. I had been blessed with my mother's dark hair and what Mrs. Dalton generously called striking features. No, I had no prospects, because no gentleman in his right mind would risk association with someone believed to bring misfortune. My father assured me that he had sufficient funds to support me for the rest of his life and beyond. He never spoke of his disappointment at not having grandchildren, never suggested that I was in any way a burden. But I saw the way he looked at me sometimes, when he thought I was absorbed in my reading, and I knew he worried about what would become of me when he was gone. I had resigned myself to spinsterhood with a grace I did not entirely feel. I told myself that there were worse fates than a life of quiet scholarship, that I would be content with my books and my walks across the moor and Mrs. Dalton's companionship. I almost believed it. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in May, when the apple trees in our modest orchard were heavy with blossoms and the world seemed determined to showcase its most optimistic face, my father received a letter that would alter the trajectory of my carefully managed expectations. The envelope was of expensive paper, sealed with wax that bore an unfamiliar crest. My father opened it at the breakfast table, his expression moving from curiosity to surprise, to something I could not quite identify. He read the contents twice before looking up at me with an odd mixture of hope and apprehension. Count Sebastian Ashford, recently returned from extensive travels abroad and newly installed in his ancestral estate, requested the pleasure of our company for an extended house party. The invitation was for a fortnight, beginning in just 10 days' time. I was stunned into silence. Count Ashford was hardly an unknown figure, even to someone as socially isolated as myself. His return to England had been the subject of considerable speculation in the newspapers my father received from London. The Ashford family had suffered a series of tragedies. The old count had died, followed within months by his 2 eldest sons, leaving Sebastian, the youngest and reportedly least expected heir, to inherit everything. The rumors about him were deliciously Gothic. Some said he had fled England years ago under a cloud of suspicion, though no one could quite agree on what he was suspected of having done. Others claimed he had spent his time on the continent, engaged in various scandalous pursuits. A few suggested he was cursed himself, doomed to watch everyone he loved perish before him. That last rumor, I confess, caught my attention more than the others. My father was characteristically pragmatic about the invitation. He suggested that Count Ashford, having been away from England for so long, might be unaware of my reputation. Or perhaps, having suffered his own share of tragedy and gossip, he was less inclined to credit society's superstitions. Either way, my father seemed to view it as an opportunity for me to experience at least a taste of the social life I had been denied. I was less optimistic, but infinitely more curious. What kind of man invited a supposedly cursed woman to his home? Was he ignorant, indifferent, or intrigued? And why, after years of isolation, did the prospect of attending this house party make my heart race with something that felt dangerously close to hope? We sent our acceptance the following morning. Mrs. Dalton immediately began fussing over my wardrobe, determined that I should look my best despite our limited resources. My father assured me that I need not go if I felt uncomfortable, that we could always claim illness or pressing business, but I found that I did not want to refuse. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I wanted to step outside the safe boundaries of my circumscribed life and see what lay beyond. The 10 days before our departure crawled by with excruciating slowness. I tried to occupy myself with reading, but I found my attention wandering. I would catch myself staring out the window at nothing, my mind spinning elaborate scenarios of what I might encounter at Ashford Manor. I imagined Count Ashford as everything from a kindly older gentleman, seeking only to be a good neighbor, to a Byronic figure shrouded in mystery and melancholy. Never, in all my imaginings, did I come close to the truth. The night before we were to leave, I stood at my bedroom window and watched a distant storm roll across the hills. Lightning flickered on the horizon, and I felt the old familiar tightness in my chest, the residue of years of knowing that others watched the same lightning and thought of me, of the darkness I supposedly carried. But that night, for reasons I could not explain, the storm did not fill me with dread. Instead, I felt a strange stirring of anticipation, as though the thunder were announcing not doom, but possibility, as though everything I had accepted as inevitable was about to be called into question. I did not sleep well that night, but when morning came and our modest carriage stood ready in the drive, I climbed aboard with a sense of purpose I had not felt in years. Mrs. Dalton pressed a small package of lemon cakes into my hands for the journey, her eyes suspiciously bright. My father settled beside me with his usual calm demeanor, though I noticed he patted my hand with uncharacteristic emotion. As we rolled out of our estate and toward whatever awaited us at Ashford Manor, I made myself a promise. I would not allow my reputation to dictate my behavior. I would not shrink from society's judgment or apologize for circumstances beyond my control. For once in my life, I would be simply Eliza, not the cursed daughter, not the girl marked by storm, but a woman capable of writing her own story. I had no way of knowing, as our carriage wound through the countryside toward the imposing silhouette of Ashford Manor in the distance, that I was traveling toward the one person who would see me exactly as I wished to be seen. That the storm that had defined my past was about to be eclipsed by a storm of an entirely different nature. That the whispers that had haunted me for 23 years were about to be drowned out by something far more powerful. The first glimpse of Ashford Manor did nothing to dispel the Gothic atmosphere that had built in my imagination during our journey. If anything, the reality exceeded even my most dramatic expectations. The estate emerged from the moorland like something conjured from the pages of a Mrs. Radcliffe novel, all severe stone and towering chimneys, wrapped in an aura of magnificent melancholy. The manor had clearly been built across several centuries, each generation adding their own architectural flourishes, resulting in a fascinating if somewhat discordant collection of Tudor solidity, Georgian elegance, and what appeared to be more recent Gothic revival embellishments. Ivy climbed the western wall with determined enthusiasm, and the windows reflected the late afternoon sun in a way that made them appear to glow from within. It was, I decided, either the most romantic or the most ominous building I had ever seen, possibly both. As our modest carriage rolled up the curved drive, I became acutely aware of the other vehicles already stationed near the entrance, each one significantly more elegant than our own. My father, sensing my discomfort, reached over and squeezed my hand with gentle reassurance. He had always possessed an uncanny ability to know when I needed his support, even when I said nothing. The front door opened before we had fully descended from the carriage, and a butler of such imposing dignity that he might have been carved from the same stone as the manor itself appeared at the threshold. He welcomed us with the precise degree of formality appropriate to our status, respectful but not effusive, and informed us that Count Ashford would receive us in the drawing room once we had been shown to our quarters and had time to refresh ourselves. I was grateful for this reprieve. The journey had left me dusty and rumpled, and I had no desire to meet our enigmatic host looking like something the cat had dragged across the moor. A maid led me to my assigned chamber, a surprisingly charming room in the east wing that overlooked the gardens. The furnishings were elegant without being ostentatious, and someone had thoughtfully placed fresh flowers on the writing desk near the window. I found myself wondering if Count Ashford had personally overseen these arrangements, or if he employed a housekeeper with exceptional attention to detail. As I changed into a fresh dress, one of only 3 I owned that could be considered suitable for such an occasion, I tried to calm the nervous flutter in my stomach. I reminded myself that I had faced worse than a house party. I had endured years of social ostracism, countless cutting remarks, and the persistent weight of society's disapproval. Surely I could manage a fortnight among strangers. Though as I descended the grand staircase half an hour later, following my father toward the drawing room, I began to question my optimism. The drawing room was already occupied by what appeared to be at least a dozen guests, all engaged in that peculiar ballet of social interaction that the upper classes had perfected over centuries. Conversations hummed at precisely the right volume, loud enough to appear animated but quiet enough to remain elegant. Teacups clinked against saucers with delicate precision. Ladies adjusted their skirts with practiced grace, while gentlemen struck poses of casual sophistication, and every single person turned to look at us as we entered. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the automatic preparation for judgment and rejection. But before I could fully steel myself, a figure detached itself from a group near the fireplace and moved toward us with purposeful strides. Count Sebastian Ashford was not what I had expected. I had imagined someone older, someone marked by tragedy in obvious ways, gray-haired perhaps, or with the kind of weathered features that spoke of suffering and loss. The man approaching us could not have been much past 30, and while his features were certainly serious, they were also striking in a way that made my breath catch unexpectedly in my throat. He was tall, with dark hair that fell with calculated carelessness across his forehead. His features were angular and aristocratic, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and a nose that suggested generations of noble breeding. But it was his eyes that truly arrested me. They were a deep brown, almost black in the drawing room's light, and they possessed an intensity that seemed to see far more than polite social interaction typically required. Those eyes settled on me with an attention that made me feel simultaneously exposed and recognized, as though he were looking past the rumors and superstitions directly to something I had long forgotten existed, the woman I might have been if circumstances had been different. He welcomed my father with appropriate courtesy, inquiring about our journey and expressing his pleasure at our arrival. But I noticed that his gaze kept returning to me, and there was something in his expression that I could not quite interpret. It was not the wariness I had come to expect, nor was it the morbid curiosity that sometimes accompanied first meetings. It was something closer to interest, genuine, unguarded interest. When he finally turned his full attention to me, offering a bow that was precisely calibrated to my status, I found myself able to meet his eyes without the usual defensive instinct to look away. There was a challenge in his gaze, as though he were testing me, trying to determine if I possessed the courage to hold my ground. I discovered, somewhat to my own surprise, that I did. He expressed his hope that I would find my accommodations comfortable and his estate diverting. His voice was cultured but held a slight roughness around the edges, as though he had spent significant time in places where English was not the primary language. There was something in his manner that suggested a man who had traveled extensively and been changed by the experience, a certain cosmopolitan ease mixed with a fundamental restlessness. Before I could formulate an appropriately bland response, a woman's voice cut through our exchange with the precision of a well-aimed knife. Lady Pemberton, whom I recognized from my father's descriptions of London society, had materialized at Count Ashford's elbow, with the kind of timing that suggested she had been waiting for precisely this moment. She was a handsome woman in her mid-40s, widowed and wealthy, with the kind of confidence that came from knowing one's place in the social hierarchy was secure. Behind her stood her daughter, Miss Caroline Pemberton, a vision of blonde perfection, who looked at Count Ashford with an expression of poorly concealed adoration. Lady Pemberton's greeting to my father was cordial enough, but when her eyes landed on me, I saw the flicker of recognition, followed by barely disguised dismay. She knew exactly who I was, and she was clearly wondering what on earth Count Ashford was thinking by inviting me. She wasted no time in making her concerns known, though she wrapped them in a veneer of polite inquiry. She expressed surprise at seeing us, mentioned that she had not realized we were acquainted with Count Ashford, and made several pointed comments about the unexpectedness of the guest list. Each remark was calculated to remind everyone present that I was not supposed to be there, that my presence was an aberration requiring explanation. I felt the familiar heat of embarrassment rising in my cheeks, but before I could retreat into my usual defensive silence, Count Ashford did something unexpected. He turned to Lady Pemberton with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes, and informed her that he made a point of inviting interesting people to his gatherings, rather than simply collecting the usual suspects from London's social circuit. The implication was clear. I was interesting. The usual suspects were not. Lady Pemberton's expression suggested she had just bitten into something unexpectedly sour, but she was too well-bred to openly challenge her host. She withdrew with her daughter in tow, though not before Miss Caroline cast a wounded look at Count Ashford that would have been comical if it had not been quite so pathetic. My father, sensing that I might need a moment to collect myself, engaged Count Ashford in conversation about the estate's history. I was grateful for the reprieve, though I remained acutely aware of the whispers that had begun to circulate around the room. I could not hear the specific words, but I knew their general content. The other guests were speculating about my presence, wondering about my connection to the Count, and quite possibly warning each other about my supposed curse. I had experienced this before, countless times, but it never became easier. Each time, I felt the same combination of anger, shame, and weary resignation. Anger that I should be judged for circumstances completely beyond my control. Shame that some part of me still believed I might somehow deserve their censure. Resignation that this was simply the reality of my existence, and no amount of protest would change it. But then I felt a presence at my side, and I turned to find Count Ashford had somehow extricated himself from my father's conversation, and now stood beside me, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of sandalwood, and something else I could not identify, something that spoke of distant places and experiences foreign to my sheltered existence. He did not acknowledge the whispers or the stares. Instead, he asked if I would care to see the library, as he had been informed by mutual acquaintances that I was something of a scholar. The question was phrased as casual inquiry, but there was something in his tone that suggested it was anything but casual. It was an offering, I realized, a chance to escape the drawing room's oppressive atmosphere, and perhaps to discover whether the connection I had sensed between us was real or merely my desperate imagination. I accepted with a dignity I did not entirely feel, and we made our way out of the drawing room under the watchful eyes of every guest present. I could practically hear their thoughts. What was he doing? Singling out the cursed girl? Was he unaware of her reputation? Or was there something more sinister at play? The library, when we reached it, proved to be everything I had dared hope for and more. It was a vast room that stretched across what must have been the entire length of the manor's south wing, with floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with volumes that showed evidence of being read, rather than merely displayed. Tall windows overlooked a formal garden, and the late afternoon light streamed in at angles that made the dust motes dance like tiny stars. I forgot, for a moment, to be self-conscious. I forgot about Lady Pemberton's disapproval and the other guests' whispers, and even Count Ashford's disconcerting presence. I simply stared at the books with the kind of hunger that probably should have embarrassed me, but somehow did not. Count Ashford made a sound that might have been amusement, and when I tore my gaze away from the shelves to look at him, I found him watching me with an expression I could not quite decipher. There was something in his eyes that looked almost like recognition, as though he understood exactly what I was feeling, because he had felt it himself. He told me I was welcome to avail myself of the library whenever I wished during my stay. He mentioned that he had spent considerable time acquiring these volumes during his travels, and that he found it gratifying to meet someone who actually appreciated books, rather than viewing them as mere decoration. I thanked him with more warmth than I had intended, and for a moment, we simply stood there in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by thousands of stories, and something passed between us that felt significant in a way I could not yet articulate. It was not attraction, precisely, though I could not deny that the man was disturbingly handsome. It was something deeper and more unsettling, a sense of kinship, of finding someone who understood what it meant to be marked by circumstances beyond one's control, to be judged by rumors rather than reality. He asked me about my reading preferences, and I found myself answering with an honesty I rarely displayed with strangers. I confessed my love of philosophy, my fascination with the natural sciences, my guilty pleasure in Gothic novels despite their frequently absurd plots. He listened with an attention that seemed genuine, occasionally interjecting with his own observations or recommendations. We talked for perhaps 20 minutes, though it felt both longer and shorter than that. We discussed Voltaire and Newton, Byron and Wollstonecraft. We debated the merits of Aristotelian logic versus more modern philosophical approaches. We even touched briefly on the question of superstition and its grip on otherwise rational minds. And through it all, I felt something shifting inside me, some long-frozen part of my heart beginning to thaw. I had spent so many years protecting myself, building walls to keep out the hurt and judgment, that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to simply talk with someone who saw me as a person rather than a portent. When a servant arrived to inform us that dinner would be served shortly, I felt an absurd disappointment. I wanted to remain in that library, in that moment of connection, rather than return to the social performance that awaited us in the dining room. But Count Ashford offered his arm with such natural courtesy that I could not refuse, and we made our way back through the manor's corridors, toward the inevitable awkwardness of a formal dinner where I would undoubtedly be the subject of speculation and careful avoidance. Except that was not what happened. Count Ashford seated me to his right at the dinner table, a position of honor that immediately sent ripples of shock through the assembled guests. Lady Pemberton looked as though she might faint from the impropriety of it all. Miss Caroline's perfect composure finally cracked, revealing something sharp and ugly beneath the surface. Several other guests exchanged glances that ranged from confused to scandalized. And I, who had spent 23 years being relegated to the periphery of social gatherings, found myself at the center of attention for the first time in my life, not because of my supposed curse, but because a man of considerable standing had chosen to honor me with his attention. I should have been terrified. Part of me was, but another part, a part I had thought long dead, felt a dangerous flutter of something that might have been hope. As the first course was served and conversation began to flow around the table, Count Ashford turned to me and asked my opinion on a recent scientific paper regarding the nature of electricity that had been published in one of the journals. It was not a question designed to make me comfortable or to show off his own knowledge. It was a genuine inquiry, asked as though my thoughts on the matter actually held value. And in that moment, surrounded by people who had spent my entire life treating me as an object of fear or pity, I felt something I had never experienced before. I felt seen. Not as the cursed daughter or the tragic figure or the social pariah, but as Eliza, a woman with thoughts and opinions and worth that existed independent of the circumstances of her birth. It was intoxicating. It was terrifying. And it was, I would later realize, the beginning of everything. The following days at Ashford Manor unfolded in a pattern that was both exhilarating and unsettling. I found myself caught between two worlds: the formal social gatherings where I remained an object of curiosity and suspicion, and the increasingly frequent private conversations with Count Ashford that felt like discovering a language I had always known but never had the opportunity to speak. He sought my company with a deliberateness that could not be mistaken for mere politeness. Each morning, I would find him in the library at precisely the time I had mentioned preferring to read. Each afternoon, when the other guests engaged in the usual pursuits, cards, gossip, elaborate preparations for dinner, he would suggest a walk through the grounds or a tour of some interesting corner of the estate. And each evening, regardless of where the seating arrangements placed us at dinner, he would find a way to continue our earlier conversations. The other guests noticed, of course. It would have been impossible for them not to. Lady Pemberton's disapproval had evolved from subtle innuendo to barely concealed hostility. She made it her mission to remind everyone within earshot of my unfortunate reputation, always couching her remarks in concern for Count Ashford's well-being. She wondered aloud whether he was aware of the tragedies that seemed to follow me. She mentioned, with affected casualness, that several families of her acquaintance would never dream of associating with someone of my unfortunate circumstances. She even went so far as to suggest that perhaps Count Ashford's time abroad had made him unaware of certain English social conventions regarding suitable company. Miss Caroline took a different approach. She attempted to monopolize Sebastian's attention through a campaign of relentless charm, playing the pianoforte with affected emotion, engaging him in conversations about art and culture with carefully rehearsed observations, appearing in the morning room at precisely the times he was known to take his coffee. She was beautiful, accomplished, and eminently suitable. She represented everything a count should want in a wife. And yet, he kept returning to me. I tried not to read too much into his attention. I reminded myself that he had been away from England for years, that perhaps he simply enjoyed intellectual conversation with someone who had actually read the books in his library, rather than merely admired their bindings. I told myself that his interest was that of a fellow outcast recognizing a kindred spirit, nothing more. But there were moments when I could not quite convince myself of my own rationalizations. There was the afternoon he found me in the conservatory, attempting to sketch one of the exotic orchids that bloomed in impossible profusion under the glass dome. I had never claimed any artistic talent, and my efforts were, to be charitable, amateur at best. But he sat beside me on the bench and watched my clumsy attempts with an attention that suggested he found them far more interesting than they deserved. He told me about acquiring that particular orchid in the mountains of South America, about the months he had spent there studying the indigenous people's botanical knowledge. His voice carried a wistfulness that spoke of a man who had found freedom in distance, who had used travel as an escape from something he could not quite name. I found myself asking him why he had returned to England, if his time abroad had been so fulfilling. It was perhaps too personal a question, but something about the way the afternoon light filtered through the glass, creating a world separate from the rest of the manor, made normal social boundaries feel less relevant. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the orchid rather than on me. Then he spoke of duty and inheritance, of the weight of expectations, and the inescapability of one's past. He mentioned, with a bitterness that surprised me, how his family had always viewed him as the expendable son, the one sent away when convenient, the one whose happiness was secondary to the preservation of the family name and fortune. And then he said something that made my heart contract painfully in my chest. He told me that they had blamed him for every misfortune that befell the family, that they had half convinced him he truly was cursed, until he had fled to the continent to escape their accusations. In that moment, I understood with perfect clarity why he had invited me to his home. He knew exactly what it felt like to be marked by circumstances beyond one's control, to be judged by superstition rather than substance. He recognized in me what I now recognized in him, another soul bearing the weight of others' irrational fears. The connection between us in that conservatory, surrounded by impossibly beautiful flowers blooming in an English winter, felt almost painfully intimate. I wanted to reach out to him, to offer some gesture of understanding or comfort, but I did not quite dare. Instead, I returned to my terrible sketch, and he sat beside me in companionable silence, and something unspoken passed between us that felt more significant than any words could have been. That evening at dinner, I noticed Lady Pemberton watching us with an expression that had moved beyond disapproval into something approaching alarm. She had realized, I think, that whatever was developing between Sebastian and myself was not the casual interest of a bored aristocrat, but something deeper and potentially more permanent. She began a campaign of strategic intervention. Whenever Sebastian and I found ourselves in conversation, she would materialize with some urgent matter requiring his attention. She arranged activities specifically designed to separate us, elaborate excursions that I was pointedly not invited to, intimate gatherings in the music room where my presence would supposedly be uncomfortable for the other guests. She even went so far as to approach my father, expressing her concerns about my health, and suggesting that perhaps the excitement of the house party was too much for someone of my delicate constitution. My father, bless him, responded with the kind of dry wit that had always been his greatest weapon against foolishness. He assured Lady Pemberton that I had never been delicate in my life, that I possessed a constitution of remarkable strength, and that he had every confidence in my ability to manage my own social interactions. The dismissal was subtle, but unmistakable, and Lady Pemberton withdrew with her dignity barely intact. But her interference had consequences I had not anticipated. The other guests, taking their cue from her obvious disapproval, began to treat me with even greater wariness. Conversations would halt when I entered a room. Seats beside me at breakfast would remain conspicuously empty. During group activities, I would find myself inevitably partnered with my father, or left to observe from the margins. I told myself it did not matter, that I had experienced worse and survived, but the truth was that it hurt more now than it had before. Before coming to Ashford Manor, I had resigned myself to isolation, but Sebastian's attention had awakened something in me, a hunger for connection, for acceptance, for the possibility of a life beyond the narrow confines society had constructed around me, and having glimpsed that possibility, it was infinitely more painful to watch it being systematically dismantled by Lady Pemberton's machinations. There was one evening in particular that tested my resolve nearly to breaking. The guests had gathered in the music room for an impromptu concert. Miss Caroline performed a complicated piece on the pianoforte with impressive technical skill, followed by a young gentleman who sang a rather maudlin ballad about lost love. The atmosphere was convivial, and for once I allowed myself to relax slightly, to enjoy the music without constantly monitoring my surroundings for signs of hostility. And then Miss Caroline, perhaps emboldened by the applause she had received, suggested that we might enjoy a parlor game. She proposed that each person share a story of the most fortunate event in their life, a celebration of good luck and happy accidents. I felt my stomach drop. Whether by design or genuine thoughtlessness, though I suspected the former, she had chosen a game that would inevitably highlight my own unfortunate reputation. How could I participate in a celebration of good fortune when everyone present believed I brought only misfortune? I prepared to excuse myself, to claim fatigue or a headache or any of the other socially acceptable reasons for withdrawal. But before I could stand, Sebastian spoke. He announced that he would begin, and he proceeded to tell a story that silenced the entire room. He spoke of traveling through Italy during a particularly harsh winter, of falling desperately ill in a small village where he knew no one and spoke the language poorly. He described how he had been convinced he would die there, alone and unmourned, far from anything familiar. And then he told us about the village doctor who had cared for him, despite having no hope of payment, about the farmer's family who had taken him into their home during his recovery, about the kindness of strangers who had saved his life for no reason other than common human decency. He spoke of how that experience had fundamentally changed his understanding of fortune and misfortune, of how he had learned that what appeared to be disaster could become the doorway to unexpected grace. The story was moving, certainly, but what struck me most was the way he looked at me as he told it. His eyes held mine with an intensity that made it clear he was not simply recounting a travel anecdote. He was offering me something, an alternative narrative, perhaps, or a challenge to the assumptions that governed our lives. When he finished, there was a moment of profound silence. Then several guests offered polite applause, though I noticed that Lady Pemberton looked as though she had swallowed something particularly unpleasant. Miss Caroline's expression suggested she had just realized that her game had not unfolded as she had intended. The evening continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Other guests shared their stories, but they seemed somehow less significant after Sebastian's tale. When the gathering finally disbanded and we all retired to our respective chambers, I found myself unable to sleep. I stood at my window, looking out over the moonlit gardens, trying to understand what was happening to me. I had come to Ashford Manor expecting nothing, or perhaps expecting only the familiar pattern of rejection and isolation. Instead, I had found someone who seemed to see past my reputation to something I had almost forgotten existed, my actual self. But what did Sebastian truly want from me? Was he simply a kind man offering friendship to someone who desperately needed it? Or was there something more in the way he looked at me, in the deliberate attention he paid to my thoughts and feelings? And more frightening still, what did I want from him? I had spent so many years protecting my heart, building defenses against disappointment and hurt, that I was not entirely sure I still knew how to want anything beyond safety and solitude. The idea of allowing myself to hope for more, to imagine that someone like Sebastian might genuinely care for someone like me, felt impossibly dangerous. Yet the hope persisted, stubborn and inconvenient, refusing to be silenced by rational caution. The following morning brought unexpected drama that would force both Sebastian and me to confront questions we had been carefully avoiding. A violent storm had rolled in during the night, and several of the guest servants reported that a section of the estate's old wall had collapsed, blocking the main road back to the village. We were, for the moment, effectively trapped at Ashford Manor until repairs could be made. The news created a peculiar atmosphere among the guests. Some seemed genuinely distressed by the delay in their departures. Others appeared secretly pleased by the extension of the house party, and Lady Pemberton looked as though she had finally found the ammunition she needed. She wasted no time in declaring that the storm was obviously related to my presence, that it was further evidence of the curse I carried. She suggested, with an attempt at delicacy that fooled no one, that perhaps it would be best if I removed myself from the manor to prevent further calamities. I felt the familiar shame and anger rising in my throat, but before I could formulate any response, Sebastian intervened with a forcefulness that shocked everyone present. He informed Lady Pemberton, in terms that bordered on rudeness, that he would not tolerate superstitious nonsense in his home. He pointed out that storms were a feature of the English climate, not evidence of supernatural influence. And he made it abundantly clear that any guest who found my presence uncomfortable was welcome to brave the blocked roads and make their way home through whatever means they could devise. The silence that followed was absolute. No one had expected such a direct confrontation, least of all Lady Pemberton, who looked as though she had been physically struck. Miss Caroline's face had gone pale, and several other guests suddenly found their breakfast plates fascinating. Sebastian then turned to me, and the anger in his expression softened into something that made my breath catch. He asked if I would join him in the library after breakfast, as he had something particular he wished to discuss with me. I managed to nod, though I was not entirely certain my voice would have cooperated if I had attempted speech. The rest of breakfast passed in uncomfortable near silence. Lady Pemberton and her daughter departed immediately afterward, claiming they needed to rest after such an upsetting morning. The other guests scattered to various corners of the manor, perhaps sensing that remaining in the breakfast room might expose them to further uncomfortable scenes. My father caught my eye across the table, his expression a mixture of concern and something that might have been hope. He had always wanted happiness for me, even when I had convinced myself it was impossible. Now, seeing the way Sebastian had defended me, he seemed to recognize that perhaps impossible was not the same as unattainable. When I finally made my way to the library, my hands were trembling. I found Sebastian standing by one of the tall windows, looking out at the storm-darkened landscape. He did not turn when I entered, and for a moment I simply stood there, uncertain whether to speak or wait for him to acknowledge my presence. Finally he spoke, his voice low and intense. He told me that he had not invited me to Ashford Manor on a whim, that he had been aware of my reputation before sending the invitation. He confessed that he had been curious about whether the woman behind the rumors bore any resemblance to the monster society had created. And then he turned to face me, and the expression in his eyes made my heart pound with an intensity that was almost painful. He told me that he had found something far more extraordinary than he had anticipated, a woman of intelligence, courage, and grace, who had somehow survived years of unjust persecution without becoming bitter or broken. He said that speaking with me these past days had been the most genuine pleasure he had experienced since returning to England, perhaps since long before then. I stood frozen, unable to process what I was hearing. Was he truly saying what I thought he was saying? Or was I so desperate for acceptance that I was reading meanings into his words that he had never intended? He must have seen the confusion and fear in my face, because he crossed the room to stand before me, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. He asked me, very quietly, if he had mistaken the connection he felt between us, if I shared any of the feelings that had been growing in him with each conversation, each shared moment of understanding. And I, who had spent 23 years learning to guard my heart and expect nothing, found myself unable to maintain those defenses. I confessed, in a voice barely above a whisper, that I had never felt this way before, that I was terrified of the intensity of what I felt when I was near him. The smile that crossed his face was unlike anything I had seen from him before, unguarded, genuine, and full of a warmth that seemed to transform his usually serious features into something approaching joy. But before either of us could say anything more, we heard voices in the corridor outside, Lady Pemberton's unmistakable tones, speaking to someone about the impropriety of the Count's attention to an unsuitable guest. The spell broke. Sebastian's expression hardened, and I felt the familiar weight of reality settling back onto my shoulders. Whatever was developing between us existed in a fragile bubble, constantly threatened by the harsh judgments of the world outside. Sebastian assured me that he did not care about society's opinions, that he had spent too many years allowing others to dictate his choices. But I could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between what he wanted and what his position demanded. I left the library feeling more confused than ever, torn between hope and despair, between the extraordinary possibility that Sebastian truly cared for me and the practical certainty that any relationship between us would face insurmountable obstacles. The storm continued to rage outside, wind howling around the manor's towers, and I could not help but think that it was a fitting metaphor for the turmoil I felt within. Everything I had accepted as inevitable was being called into question. Everything I had resigned myself to losing seemed suddenly, impossibly, within reach, and I had absolutely no idea whether reaching for it would lead to happiness or heartbreak. The atmosphere at Ashford Manor had become nearly unbearable. 3 days had passed since Sebastian's public defense of me, and the tension among the guests had evolved from uncomfortable to positively oppressive. Lady Pemberton had marshaled her forces, gathering those guests most susceptible to superstitious thinking into something resembling a campaign against my continued presence. They did not speak to me directly, of course. That would have been too crude, too obvious. Instead, they employed the weapons of whispers and pointed silences, of conversations that stopped when I entered a room and resumed with altered topics when I departed. They spoke of other things, of family tragedies and unexpected accidents, of storms and misfortunes, always with enough ambiguity that they could claim innocence if challenged, but with sufficient clarity that their meaning was unmistakable. Even my father, who possessed admirable reserves of patience, had begun to look worn by the constant undercurrent of hostility. He suggested more than once that perhaps we should attempt to leave despite the blocked roads, that we could travel on horseback if necessary, but I found myself curiously reluctant to depart, despite the discomfort of our situation. The truth, which I was only beginning to acknowledge to myself, was that I could not bear the thought of leaving Sebastian. Whatever was developing between us, this fragile, complicated thing that we had not yet dared to name, felt too precious to abandon without fully understanding what it might become. Sebastian himself had become noticeably more withdrawn since our conversation in the library. He still sought my company, but there was a tension in him that had not been present before, as though he were engaged in some internal struggle that he could not, or would not share. I caught him watching me sometimes with an expression of such conflicted intensity that it made my heart ache. Lady Pemberton, sensing that her campaign was having an effect, increased her efforts. She arranged a dinner where the seating deliberately separated Sebastian and me by the entire length of the table. She organized an elaborate card tournament that I was not invited to participate in, citing concerns about the appropriateness of gambling in mixed company, though of course Miss Caroline and the other young ladies were welcome to observe. She even went so far as to suggest to Sebastian that perhaps he might consider cutting the house party short, given the unfortunate weather and the discomfort it was causing some of his guests. I do not know what Sebastian's response was to that particular suggestion, but I noticed that Lady Pemberton emerged from their private conversation, looking pale and shaken, and she did not raise the topic again. The storm that had trapped us at the manor showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to be gathering strength. Each night I would lie in my bed listening to the wind howl around the towers and the rain lash against the windows, and I would wonder if perhaps the villagers were right about me after all. Perhaps I did carry some dark influence that manifested in tempests and misfortune. It was a ridiculous thought, I knew. My father had taught me better than to credit such superstitious nonsense. But there is something about being alone in the dark, listening to a storm rage, that makes even the most rational mind vulnerable to irrational fears. On the evening that everything changed, dinner had been particularly awkward. Miss Caroline had performed a dramatic reading of poetry that was clearly meant to showcase her refined sensibilities and artistic soul. Several guests had praised her excessively, making pointed comments about the accomplishments expected of a proper lady. The implication that I lacked such accomplishments and was therefore unsuitable company for someone of Sebastian's standing was impossible to miss. Sebastian had listened to it all with an expression of barely controlled irritation. More than once I saw his jaw tighten with what appeared to be suppressed anger, but he maintained his composure throughout the meal, playing the role of gracious host with admirable discipline. After dinner, the guests gathered in the drawing room for the usual evening entertainment. I positioned myself in a corner with a book, attempting to make myself as inconspicuous as possible. I had learned over the years that sometimes the best defense was simply to avoid drawing attention. But the evening proved more trying than usual. Lady Pemberton, perhaps emboldened by wine, or simply by her conviction that she was performing a necessary service, began to tell a story about a family she had known in her youth. A family, she said with meaningful emphasis, that had employed a governess who was rumored to be cursed. According to Lady Pemberton's tale, misfortunes had befallen the household, a fire, a riding accident, a sudden illness, until finally the family had dismissed the governess, after which their luck had immediately improved. The moral of the story was hardly subtle. Several guests nodded sagely, as though this ridiculous anecdote proved something significant about the nature of curses and their effects on innocent households. I felt my face burning with humiliation and anger. I wanted to stand and leave the room with whatever dignity I could muster, but I found myself frozen in my chair, unable to move or speak. It was as though all the years of social persecution had suddenly accumulated into this one excruciating moment, crushing me under their combined weight. And then Sebastian stood. His movement was so abrupt that it startled everyone into silence. He looked at Lady Pemberton with an expression of cold fury that made her shrink back in her seat. He thanked her, with venomous courtesy, for sharing such an illuminating tale. He then proceeded to share his own story about the stupidity and cruelty of superstitious thinking, about how societies had used such beliefs throughout history to persecute innocent people, about how disappointed he was to find such medieval attitudes persisting among supposedly educated individuals. The speech was devastating. Several guests looked deeply uncomfortable. Miss Caroline appeared close to tears, and Lady Pemberton seemed to age 10 years in the space of a few minutes. But it was the conclusion of Sebastian's speech that truly shocked the room. He announced that he would not tolerate any further disrespect toward me in his home. Any guest who could not treat me with the courtesy and respect due to a valued visitor was welcome to leave at first light. Blocked roads, or no blocked roads. The silence that followed was absolute. No one dared speak. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly, as though the flames themselves were cowed by Sebastian's anger. I could not bear it. The defense was magnificent, certainly, but it also made me feel like a child being protected, rather than a woman capable of managing her own battles. More than that, I could see what this was costing Sebastian, the damage to his social standing, the potential alienation of influential connections, the uncomfortable position he was placing himself in by championing someone society had deemed unworthy. I stood, thanked Sebastian quietly for his hospitality, and excused myself from the drawing room with as much composure as I could muster. I needed to be alone, needed to think, needed to escape the suffocating atmosphere of judgment and pity that had somehow become even worse after Sebastian's intervention. I found myself walking without conscious direction, through corridors and down staircases, until I arrived at the conservatory where Sebastian and I had shared our first truly intimate conversation. The glass dome amplified the sound of the storm, making it feel as though I were inside the tempest itself. Rain pounded against the windows with almost musical rhythm, and lightning periodically illuminated the space in stark flashes of white light. I stood among the orchids and exotic plants, surrounded by beauty that seemed almost defiant in its delicate persistence, and I allowed myself to cry. Not from self-pity. I had long ago exhausted that particular emotion, but from exhaustion and frustration, and a grief I could not quite name. Grief, perhaps, for the life I might have had if circumstances had been different. Grief for the impossibility of what I felt for Sebastian. Grief for the burden my presence had become to him, regardless of his protestations to the contrary. I do not know how long I stood there, but I gradually became aware that I was no longer alone. I turned to find Sebastian standing at the entrance to the conservatory, his hair disheveled as though he had run his hands through it repeatedly, his expression tortured. He asked if I was all right, which was such a patently absurd question given the circumstances that I nearly laughed. Instead, I told him the truth, that I was not all right, that I had not been all right for most of my life, but that I had learned to manage it, until he had come along and disrupted everything I had carefully constructed to protect myself. He moved toward me with urgent steps, and before I could retreat or gather my defenses, he was standing close enough that I could see the conflict and desire warring in his expression. He told me that he had tried to maintain appropriate distance, tried to be sensible about the complications my reputation would create for any relationship between us. He said he had attempted to convince himself that what he felt was merely sympathy, or intellectual compatibility, or any of the other rational explanations that might justify his behavior. But he could not maintain the pretense any longer. He confessed that he had fallen in love with me, completely, irrevocably, and with an intensity that frightened him. That every conversation with me, every shared moment of understanding, had only deepened what he felt. That the thought of allowing me to leave Ashford Manor, of returning to his isolated existence without the possibility of seeing me again, was unbearable. I stood there, stunned by the raw honesty of his declaration, unable to formulate any coherent response. Part of me wanted to warn him that loving me was dangerous, that my reputation would taint him by association, that Lady Pemberton's concerns were not entirely without merit, even if her methods were unconscionable. Part of me wanted to protect him from the consequences of his own feelings, but another part, a part I had tried so hard to suppress, wanted simply to surrender to what I felt, to stop being sensible and cautious, and accept the extraordinary gift he was offering. The storm outside intensified, thunder crashing so loudly that the glass overhead seemed to vibrate with the force of it. Lightning illuminated the conservatory in rapid flashes, and for a moment I could see us as though from outside, two people standing among impossible flowers while a tempest raged around them, both marked by circumstances neither had chosen, both desperately reaching for something that society insisted they should not have. I told him, my voice barely audible over the storm, that I loved him too, that I had been trying not to, trying to protect both of us from the complications such feelings would create, but that I could not maintain the denial any longer, not when he was looking at me with such naked vulnerability. Something in his expression shifted, and the careful control he had been maintaining shattered completely. He reached for me, his hands framing my face with such gentleness that it seemed at odds with the intensity in his eyes. He asked, so quietly I almost could not hear him over the thunder, if he could kiss me, if I would allow him that one moment of honesty. Consequences be damned. I should have been sensible. I should have remembered all the reasons this was impossible, all the obstacles that stood between us, all the ways this could end in heartbreak and scandal. But standing there in that glass sanctuary while the storm raged and lightning split the sky, I found I did not care about sense or propriety or caution. I told him yes. His lips met mine with a hunger that matched the storm's fury. It was nothing like the chaste kisses I had occasionally witnessed at society weddings or read about in novels. It was desperate and consuming, as though he were trying to communicate through touch what words could never adequately express. His hands moved from my face to my waist, pulling me closer, and I responded with an abandon I did not know I possessed. The thunder crashed overhead, and I felt no fear. For the first time in my life, a storm felt like a celebration, rather than a threat, like nature itself was applauding this moment of absolute surrender to feeling. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sebastian rested his forehead against mine. He told me that he did not care what society thought, that he would face any scandal or consequence if it meant having me in his life. He asked me, with a vulnerability that made my heart ache, if I would consider accepting him despite all the complications my presence in his life would create. I wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to throw caution aside and embrace whatever future we might build together. But I also understood what he would be sacrificing: his social standing, his connection to influential families, perhaps even his relationship with distant relatives who might object to such an unsuitable match. I told him that I needed time to think, to consider carefully what accepting him would mean for both of us. It was not that I doubted my feelings. The kiss had rather comprehensively eliminated any uncertainty on that front, but I needed to be certain that he understood what he was offering, that he would not come to resent me when the full weight of society's disapproval descended upon us. He looked pained but seemed to understand. He told me he would wait, that he would give me whatever time I needed. But his eyes held a plea that words did not voice, a desperate hope that I would find the courage to choose him despite all the rational reasons I should not. We stood there for a long moment, surrounded by glass and storm and the lingering electricity of what had just passed between us. Then, with obvious reluctance, Sebastian suggested we return to the manor separately to avoid further gossip. The practical consideration felt almost absurd given what we had just shared, but I recognized its wisdom. I made my way back to my chamber through deserted corridors, grateful that the other guests had apparently retired for the evening. I needed solitude to process what had happened, to understand the magnitude of the decision I now faced. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and haunted by dreams of storms and choices and futures that seemed simultaneously impossible and inevitable. I woke before dawn, no closer to certainty than I had been the night before, but with a growing conviction that whatever I decided would fundamentally alter the course of my life. The storm had finally broken. Through my window, I could see the first hints of sunrise painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The air felt cleansed, renewed, as though the tempest had washed away something old to make room for something new. I dressed with unusual care, knowing that today I would need to give Sebastian my answer. As I made my way down to breakfast, my heart pounding with anticipation and anxiety, I had no way of knowing that the morning would bring complications I had never anticipated. Complications that would force both Sebastian and me to confront not just society's judgment, but our own deepest fears about what we truly deserved. The breakfast room felt different that morning, charged with an energy I could not quite identify. Perhaps it was merely my own heightened awareness, the residual electricity from the previous night's storm, both meteorological and emotional, that made everything seem sharper, more vivid, more significant than it had any right to be. Or perhaps it was the fact that Lady Pemberton and her coterie of supporters were conspicuously absent. I entered the room to find only a handful of guests present, including my father, who looked up from his newspaper with an expression of mingled concern and curiosity. He had always possessed an uncanny ability to sense when something significant had occurred, even without being told the specifics. Sebastian was not yet present, which gave me a few moments to collect myself before facing him. I took a seat beside my father and attempted to focus on the toast and tea that a servant placed before me, though my appetite had seemingly vanished, along with my certainty about what the future held. My father leaned toward me and spoke in a voice low enough that the other guests could not overhear. He told me that there had been quite a commotion earlier that morning. Lady Pemberton had apparently demanded that arrangements be made for her immediate departure. Blocked roads be damned. She had declared that she would not spend another night under a roof where propriety was so flagrantly disregarded and where the host showed such poor judgment in his associations. Several other families had apparently decided to join her exodus, choosing to brave the muddy roads rather than remain at a house party that had become so uncomfortable. The servants were even now preparing carriages and helping guests pack their belongings with impressive efficiency. I felt a complicated mixture of relief and guilt. Relief that I would no longer have to endure Lady Pemberton's barely concealed hostility and pointed remarks. Guilt that Sebastian's house party had effectively collapsed, because of his defense of me, because of his refusal to bow to social pressure regarding my presence. Before I could fully process this information, Sebastian entered the breakfast room. Our eyes met across the space, and I felt that now familiar jolt of connection, intensified by the memory of his lips on mine, his hands on my waist, his voice confessing feelings I had never dared hope anyone would feel for me. He moved toward our table with purposeful strides, and I noticed that he looked as though he had slept as poorly as I had. There were shadows beneath his eyes, and his expression held a tension that suggested he had spent the night wrestling with questions as difficult as my own. He greeted my father with appropriate courtesy, then turned his attention to me. He asked, with a formality that seemed almost painful given the intimacy we had shared the previous night, if I might join him for a walk in the gardens once I had finished breakfast. The morning was clear, he noted, and the fresh air might prove restorative after so many days confined indoors by the storm. I agreed, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears, too high, too tight, as though my throat had constricted with nervousness. My father watched this exchange with an expression I could not quite read, though I thought I detected a glimmer of understanding and perhaps approval in his eyes. The walk to the gardens was conducted in silence, both of us seemingly uncertain how to begin the conversation that needed to happen. The storm had left its mark on the landscape. Broken branches scattered across the lawn, flower beds disturbed by wind and rain, puddles reflecting the morning sky like scattered mirrors. But there was also a freshness to the air, a sense of renewal that seemed almost symbolic. We stopped beside a fountain that had been turned off for the winter, its basin filled with fallen leaves and rainwater. Sebastian turned to face me, and I saw in his expression all the vulnerability and hope and fear that I felt reflected in my own heart. He told me that he had spent the night thinking about what I had said, about needing time to consider what accepting him would mean. He said he understood my hesitation, that he recognized the complications my reputation would create for any relationship between us, but he wanted me to know, with absolute clarity, that he had already made his choice. Whatever society thought, whatever obstacles we might face, he wanted to build a life with me. The declaration was both thrilling and terrifying. I wanted to say yes immediately, to throw myself into his arms and accept the extraordinary gift he was offering. But I also knew that I needed to voice my concerns, needed to ensure he truly understood what he would be sacrificing. I told him about my fears, that his family and social connections would suffer because of his association with me, that he would come to resent me when invitations stopped arriving, and his reputation suffered by association with someone deemed cursed. I reminded him that I brought nothing to the match beyond my father's modest estate and my own controversial presence, that Miss Caroline or any number of other suitable young ladies could offer him alliances and connections that I could never provide. Sebastian listened to my litany of concerns with an expression that grew increasingly determined. When I finally fell silent, having exhausted my list of objections, he took my hands in his with such gentleness that I felt tears prick at my eyes. He told me that he had spent years living according to others' expectations, allowing society's judgment to dictate his choices and relationships. His family had blamed him for every misfortune, had made him feel like a harbinger of doom, until he had fled to the continent to escape their accusations. He had thought distance would solve the problem, but instead it had only taught him that running from judgment did not eliminate its power. It merely gave that judgment control over his life. Meeting me, he said, had changed something fundamental in his understanding. I had faced similar accusations, similar irrational blame for circumstances beyond my control, yet I had not allowed it to destroy me. I had maintained my intelligence, my integrity, my capacity for connection despite years of social persecution. I had shown him that it was possible to define oneself in opposition to society's narratives, rather than being defined by them. He told me that he did not want alliances or connections based on convenience and social acceptability. He wanted a partnership built on genuine understanding, on shared experiences of surviving others' judgment, on intellectual compatibility and emotional honesty. He wanted me, exactly as I was, with all the complications my presence would create. The speech was so earnest, so vulnerable, that I felt my carefully constructed defenses crumbling. How could I protect him from consequences he claimed to welcome? How could I deny us both the possibility of happiness because I was afraid of what others might think? But before I could formulate a response, we were interrupted by the sound of someone approaching. We turned to find one of Sebastian's footmen hurrying toward us with an expression of concern. He apologized for the interruption, but informed Sebastian that his presence was urgently required in the drawing room. There had been an incident involving one of the departing guests. Sebastian's jaw tightened with obvious frustration at the interruption, but duty compelled him to respond. He asked me to wait for him, promised we would continue our conversation as soon as he had resolved whatever crisis required his attention. Then he strode back toward the manor with the footman at his heels, leaving me alone beside the fountain with my thoughts in turmoil. I stood there for perhaps 10 minutes, trying to organize my feelings into something coherent. The morning sun was warm on my face, and birds sang in the trees as though celebrating the storm's passing. Everything around me spoke of renewal and new beginnings, and I found myself wondering if perhaps I was being offered the same opportunity, a chance to move beyond the limitations I had accepted as inevitable and embrace a future I had never dared imagine. The decision crystallized in that moment. Yes, there would be obstacles. Yes, society would judge us harshly. Yes, there would be consequences for Sebastian's social standing and my own tentative position in even the limited circles I had access to. But the alternative, walking away from the one person who had seen past my reputation to the woman I actually was, who had offered me not just acceptance but genuine love, seemed suddenly unbearable. I would say yes. I would accept Sebastian's offer. Consequences be damned, and we would face whatever came together. But when I returned to the manor, filled with new resolve and eager to share my decision, I found a scene of such chaos that my heart immediately sank. The entrance hall was crowded with guests and servants, all talking at once in voices that ranged from concerned to accusatory. At the center of the commotion stood Miss Caroline Pemberton, her face streaked with tears, her dress torn at the shoulder, her hair disheveled in a way that suggested genuine distress rather than artful arrangement. And beside her stood Lady Pemberton, her expression a mixture of maternal concern and something darker, something that looked almost like triumph. Sebastian stood apart from the crowd, his face pale, his expression shocked. When his eyes met mine across the chaos, I saw confusion and alarm, and something that might have been plea for understanding. Lady Pemberton's voice cut through the cacophony with the precision of a blade. She announced, with barely suppressed satisfaction, that her daughter had been attacked, assaulted by some malevolent force in her chamber during the early morning hours. Objects had flown from shelves, curtains had torn themselves from their rods, and Miss Caroline had been thrown to the floor by an invisible hand. The implication was obvious. The other guests began to murmur among themselves, casting nervous glances in my direction. The curse, Lady Pemberton declared with theatrical gravity, had finally manifested in undeniable form. Her poor daughter had been targeted because she had attempted to protect Count Ashford from an unsuitable attachment. The house itself had become dangerous as long as I remained within its walls. I felt as though I had been physically struck. The accusation was so absurd, so transparently calculated, that I could not initially formulate any response. But as I looked around at the assembled guests, I saw that many of them appeared to credit Lady Pemberton's story. Fear and superstition had overcome whatever rational thought they might have possessed. My father pushed through the crowd to stand beside me, his expression furious. He began to challenge Lady Pemberton's narrative, to point out the obvious inconsistencies and the convenient timing of this supposed supernatural attack. But his voice was drowned out by the general commotion. Sebastian attempted to restore order, demanding that everyone calm themselves, and that Lady Pemberton provide a rational explanation for her daughter's condition. But I could see that even he was shaken, not by belief in supernatural forces, but by the sudden escalation of an already difficult situation. And then, Miss Caroline herself spoke, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine fear. She described waking to the sensation of being watched, of feeling malevolent presence in her room. She claimed that objects had moved of their own accord, that she had been pushed and grabbed by invisible hands, that she had heard whispers in a language she did not understand. The performance was impressive, I had to admit. She had either convinced herself of the story's truth, or was a far better actress than I had given her credit for. Lady Pemberton turned to Sebastian with an expression of sorrowful determination. She told him that she understood he had been bewitched, that it was not his fault he had fallen under my influence, but she could not in good conscience leave her daughter or any of the other guests in danger. She demanded that I be removed from the premises immediately, for the safety of everyone present. The moment hung suspended, all eyes turning to Sebastian to see how he would respond. This was his opportunity to capitulate, to choose the socially acceptable path and distance himself from me. No one would blame him. He could claim he had been deceived, that he had not fully understood the danger I posed. He could protect his reputation and his social standing by simply agreeing to Lady Pemberton's demand. I found myself holding my breath, a part of me almost expecting him to take the easy way out. After all, we had known each other for less than a fortnight. The feelings between us, however intense, were new and untested. Why would he sacrifice so much for someone he barely knew? But I had underestimated Sebastian Ashford. He drew himself up to his full height and addressed the assembled crowd with a voice that carried absolute authority. He stated that he would not entertain accusations of supernatural activity in his home. He suggested that Miss Caroline had likely experienced a nightmare, or that the storm had caused some structural issue in her chamber that had resulted in falling objects. He made it clear that he would not permit any guest to be falsely accused or mistreated based on superstitious nonsense. Lady Pemberton's expression transformed from sorrowful concern to barely concealed rage. She declared that if Sebastian would not take appropriate action, then she would ensure that all of society knew of his poor judgment. She would make certain that every influential family understood the danger he had exposed his guests to. She would see to it that his reputation suffered appropriately for his reckless disregard of common sense and decency. The threat was clear. Sebastian could either distance himself from me or face social ruin. I could not allow him to make that sacrifice. Before he could respond to Lady Pemberton's ultimatum, I stepped forward and announced that I would be leaving Ashford Manor immediately. I thanked Sebastian for his hospitality, apologized for any disruption my presence had caused, and asked my father to arrange for our departure within the hour. The relief on some guests' faces was palpable. Lady Pemberton looked satisfied, as though she had achieved exactly what she intended. Miss Caroline's tears seemed to diminish somewhat, suggesting that perhaps her distress had been less severe than initially claimed. But Sebastian's expression, shocked, hurt, and angry in equal measure, made my heart clench painfully. I had just rejected everything he had offered me, chosen the safe path of retreat rather than the brave path of standing beside him. I could see in his eyes that he understood exactly what I was doing and why, but that understanding did nothing to diminish his obvious pain. My father, recognizing that argument would be futile and potentially dangerous, agreed to begin preparations for our departure. The crowd began to disperse, conversations resuming in hushed tones as guests processed the morning's dramatic events. I made my way to my chamber in a haze of grief and shock. I had come so close to happiness, had been on the verge of accepting Sebastian's offer and embracing a future I had never thought possible. And now, within the space of an hour, it had all been destroyed by calculated manipulation and society's persistent preference for superstition over sense. As I mechanically folded my few possessions and prepared them for packing, I heard a knock at my door. I opened it to find Sebastian standing in the corridor, his expression anguished. He asked me not to leave, told me we could face this together if I would only trust him. He said that Lady Pemberton's threats were empty, that he did not care what society thought, that nothing mattered except that we not allow fear to dictate our choices. I wanted desperately to believe him, but I also knew the reality of what we faced. Lady Pemberton was a woman of considerable influence, and she would make good on her threats. Sebastian might claim indifference to society's judgment, but I had seen firsthand how such judgment could destroy lives. I could not allow him to sacrifice everything, his connections, his standing, his future, for someone he had known for less than 2 weeks. I told him, my voice breaking despite my best efforts to maintain composure, that I could not be responsible for his ruin, that I cared for him too much to watch him destroy himself for my sake, that sometimes love meant protecting someone from the consequences of their own noble impulses. He looked as though I had struck him. He told me I was wrong, that I was allowing Lady Pemberton to win, that I was making the same mistake he had made years ago when he fled to the continent rather than fighting for what he wanted. But I could not be moved. I had made my decision, and though it was tearing my heart apart, I believed it was the right one. I thanked him for everything he had offered me, told him I would carry the memory of our time together always, and then I gently but firmly closed the door between us. I heard him stand there for a long moment, before finally walking away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor like a funeral march. Within 2 hours, My father and I were in our carriage, rolling away from Ashford Manor and the man I loved. I did not look back, could not bear to see the estate receding in the distance. Instead, I stared straight ahead and tried to convince myself that I had done the right thing, that protecting Sebastian from social ruin was more important than my own happiness. But as the miles passed and the manor disappeared from view, I felt something inside me breaking, some fragile hope I had barely allowed myself to acknowledge, now shattered beyond repair. My father reached over and took my hand in his, offering silent comfort. He did not tell me everything would be all right, or that I had made the correct choice. He simply held my hand and let me grieve for the future I had almost claimed, and then let slip through my fingers. The journey home passed in a blur. I answered my father's occasional questions with monosyllables, unable to engage in real conversation. The landscape rolled by outside the carriage windows. Green fields, stone walls, scattered cottages, but I saw none of it. I saw only Sebastian's face when I had closed the door between us, the hurt and disbelief and desperate hope that I might reconsider. By the time we arrived at our modest estate, I had cried myself into a state of exhausted numbness. Mrs. Dalton took one look at me and immediately ushered me to my chamber with promises of tea and comfort. But I knew that no amount of tea would heal what I was feeling. No words of comfort would ease the ache of loss that had settled into my bones. I had been offered everything I had ever wanted, and more than I had ever dared hope for, and I had walked away from it because I was too afraid of what it might cost the man I loved. As I lay in my familiar bed that night, staring at the ceiling of the room I had occupied my entire life, I wondered if I had made the worst mistake of my existence, if I had chosen safety over happiness, fear over love, and in doing so had condemned both Sebastian and myself to lives of lonely resignation. The storm had passed, the curse remained, and I was, once again, exactly where I had always been, alone, isolated, and convinced that this was simply my fate. Except now I knew exactly what I was missing, and that knowledge, I discovered, was far more painful than ignorance had ever been. The days following my return home stretched before me with a monotony that felt almost deliberately cruel. I had grown accustomed to isolation over the years, had learned to find contentment in my books and walks and quiet routines. But now that I had experienced something different, connection, understanding, the possibility of love, the solitude felt suffocating in a way it never had before. My father watched me with concern, but wisely refrained from offering platitudes or advice. He understood, I think, that there was nothing he could say that would ease the particular ache I was feeling. Instead, he simply made himself available, sitting with me in companionable silence, engaging me in conversations about philosophy or science when I seemed capable of such discussions, and respecting my need for solitude when words felt impossible. Mrs. Dalton was less subtle in her opinions. She declared with characteristic bluntness that I had been a fool to leave Ashford Manor, and an even greater fool to reject a man who clearly adored me. When I attempted to explain my reasoning, that I had been protecting Sebastian from social ruin, that my presence would have destroyed his standing in society, she made a sound of profound disgust. She told me that men like Count Ashford did not need protecting from their own choices, that I had insulted him by assuming he did not understand the consequences of his feelings. She suggested that perhaps I had been afraid not of what society would do to him, but of what happiness might do to me, that I had grown so accustomed to my role as the cursed outcast that I no longer knew how to imagine a different existence. Her words stung because they contained more truth than I wanted to acknowledge. Had I truly been protecting Sebastian, or had I simply been too afraid to reach for something I believed I did not deserve? A week after our return, my father received a visitor, Mr. Pemberton, Lady Pemberton's younger brother, who managed her late husband's estate. He was a pragmatic man of business, less given to superstition than his sister, and he arrived with an expression of considerable discomfort. He asked to speak with my father privately, but I was invited to join them after a few minutes of conversation. What he had to say, apparently, concerned me directly. He began with an apology. He stated that he had recently learned the full details of what had occurred at Ashford Manor, including his niece's dramatic claims of supernatural attack. He had taken it upon himself to investigate the matter, driven by suspicions about the convenient timing and theatrical nature of Miss Caroline's distress. What he had discovered was both vindicating and infuriating. Miss Caroline had confessed, under considerable pressure from her uncle, that she had staged the entire incident. She had knocked over objects in her own chamber, torn her own dress, and created the appearance of supernatural activity in a calculated attempt to force my departure from Ashford Manor. Lady Pemberton had been complicit in the deception, believing that such dramatic action was necessary to protect Count Ashford from an unsuitable attachment. Mr. Pemberton expressed his profound embarrassment at his family's behavior. He assured us that he had insisted his sister and niece write letters of apology, which he now presented to us. He also indicated that he had shared this information with Count Ashford, feeling it was important that the truth be known. I took the letters with hands that trembled slightly. Lady Pemberton's apology was stilted and formal, clearly written under duress, expressing regret for any misunderstanding her daughter's distress might have caused. Miss Caroline's was more genuinely contrite, acknowledging that she had behaved shamefully and that her actions had been motivated by jealousy and a misguided belief that she was acting in Count Ashford's best interests. Neither apology could undo the damage that had been done, but they did at least confirm what I had suspected, that the entire incident had been a calculated manipulation designed to separate Sebastian and me. After Mr. Pemberton departed, my father and I sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, he spoke, his voice gentle but firm. He told me that I now had information that changed the circumstances under which I had made my decision to leave Ashford Manor, that I had believed I was protecting Sebastian from my cursed influence, but it was now clear that the only curse involved had been other people's malicious intentions. He suggested with careful neutrality that perhaps I might wish to reconsider my decision, that perhaps it was not too late to correct what might have been a mistake born of incomplete information and understandable fear. I wanted to. Every fiber of my being yearned to return to Ashford Manor, to find Sebastian, and tell him I had been wrong, that I wanted to accept everything he had offered. But I was also terrified. What if too much time had passed? What if Sebastian had reconsidered his feelings in light of my rejection? What if I arrived only to discover that the door I had closed so firmly had locked permanently behind me? My father seemed to sense my hesitation. He reminded me, with the wisdom of someone who had lost his own great love far too early, that regret for actions not taken was far more painful than regret for risks attempted. That I could survive rejection if it came to that, but I might not survive the slow erosion of spirit that came from knowing I had been too afraid to fight for what I wanted. His words settled over me with the weight of truth I could not deny. I had spent my entire life being acted upon, by circumstance, by superstition, by others' judgment. I had allowed fear to dictate my choices, had accepted limitations that others imposed rather than defining my own boundaries, and in doing so, I had become complicit in my own isolation. But I did not have to continue that pattern. I could choose differently. I could be brave enough to reach for happiness even if it meant risking rejection. I could define myself by my courage rather than my fears. The decision crystallized with sudden clarity. I would return to Ashford Manor. I would find Sebastian and tell him everything, that I had been wrong to leave, that I wanted to accept his offer if it still stood, that I was finally brave enough to fight for the future we might build together. My father's smile when I announced my intention suggested he had been hoping for exactly this conclusion. He immediately began making arrangements for our departure, stating that we would leave at first light the following morning. There was no point, he noted with satisfaction, in delaying once the right course of action had been identified. I spent that evening in a state of nervous anticipation. I tried to read, but found myself staring at the same page for extended periods, without comprehending a single word. I attempted to prepare for bed, but was too restless to sleep. Finally, I stood at my window and looked out at the clear night sky, watching stars emerge as darkness deepened. Somewhere, perhaps looking at the same stars, was Sebastian. Was he thinking of me? Did he regret his declarations at Ashford Manor, relieved that I had saved him from a complicated entanglement? Or did he miss me with the same aching intensity that I missed him? I would know soon enough. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. The journey to Ashford Manor the following day seemed to take simultaneously forever and no time at all. My father attempted to distract me with conversation, but I was too nervous to engage properly. My mind kept rehearsing what I would say to Sebastian, discarding and revising speeches, trying to find words adequate to express everything I felt. As our carriage turned onto the drive leading to the manor, my heart began to pound with such force that I wondered if my father could hear it. The estate looked different in the clear autumn sunlight, less Gothic, more welcoming, as though the building itself reflected some internal change. But as we drew closer to the entrance, I noticed something unexpected. There were numerous carriages in the drive, far more than would be expected for a quiet morning at a private estate. People were milling about the grounds, servants carrying what appeared to be trunks and parcels, guests in fine clothing talking in animated clusters. My father and I exchanged confused glances. What was happening? We descended from our carriage, and I looked around for some explanation of the unusual activity. A servant I recognized from my previous visit approached with an expression of surprise at seeing us. He informed us, with barely concealed excitement, that Count Ashford was preparing to leave for London, that he had announced his intention to address certain rumors and accusations that had been circulating about his household, that he had invited several influential members of society to Ashford Manor for what he described as an important declaration. My stomach dropped. Sebastian was leaving, and I had arrived just in time to watch him depart, having missed whatever opportunity I might have had to speak with him privately. But before I could fully process this information, I heard a voice I would have recognized anywhere calling my name. I turned to see Sebastian striding across the drive toward us, his expression a mixture of shock, hope, and something that might have been joy. He reached us slightly out of breath, as though he had been running. He greeted my father with distracted courtesy, then turned his full attention to me. He asked what I was doing there, and I heard in his voice both desperate hope and fear that he might be misunderstanding my presence. I opened my mouth to explain about Mr. Pemberton's visit, about learning the truth of Miss Caroline's deception, about realizing I had made a terrible mistake in leaving. But before I could form the words, Lady Hartwell, one of the guests I recognized from the house party, emerged from the manor and called out to Sebastian that everyone was assembled and waiting for his address. Sebastian looked torn, clearly wanting to speak with me, but also bound by whatever commitments he had made to the assembled guests. He asked if I would wait, if I would give him perhaps half an hour to conclude his business, and then we could speak privately. I agreed, though my curiosity about what he was planning had reached almost unbearable levels. He asked my father and me to join the other guests in the drawing room, stating that what he had to say concerned me directly, and that he would prefer I hear it firsthand rather than through second-hand reports. We followed him into the manor, and I felt as though I were walking through a dream. The drawing room was filled with perhaps 20 people, many of whom I recognized as influential members of London society. They watched me enter with expressions ranging from curious to scandalized, clearly wondering what the supposedly cursed Miss Thornfield was doing at such a gathering. Sebastian positioned himself at the front of the room, and the conversations gradually quieted as everyone turned their attention to him. He looked out over the assembled crowd with an expression of calm determination, and when he began to speak, his voice carried absolute authority. He thanked everyone for accepting his invitation on such short notice. He stated that he had requested their presence because he wished to address certain rumors and accusations that had been circulating about his household, and about me specifically. He indicated that what he had to say would likely prove uncomfortable for some present, but that he believed the truth needed to be heard by those with the influence to shape society's opinions. He then proceeded to tell the entire story, how he had invited me to Ashford Manor despite knowing of my reputation, how he had discovered in me a woman of intelligence and integrity who bore no resemblance to the monster society had created, how he had come to love me with an intensity that surprised him. He described Lady Pemberton's campaign against me, Miss Caroline's staged supernatural attack, and his subsequent discovery of their deception. The room was absolutely silent. Several guests looked shocked, others uncomfortable, a few thoughtful, and then Sebastian said something that made my breath catch in my throat. He announced that he intended to marry me, if I would have him, that he was formally declaring his intentions before society's most influential members, so that there could be no doubt about his commitment or his disregard for their superstitious nonsense. He stated that anyone who wished to maintain his friendship and access to his home would need to treat me with the respect and courtesy due to the future Countess Ashford, that he would not tolerate whispers or rumors, or barely concealed hostility directed towards someone he loved, that those who could not accept these terms were welcome to depart immediately and need not expect future invitations. The declaration was shocking in its directness, scandalous in its defiance of convention. Several guests looked as though they did not know whether to applaud or flee. Lady Hartwell appeared thoughtful, as though reassessing her previous opinions. A few others nodded slowly, perhaps recognizing the courage required for such a public stand. And then Sebastian turned to look directly at me, and I saw in his eyes the same vulnerability I had seen in the conservatory during the storm. He had just risked everything: his reputation, his social standing, his relationships with powerful families, on the possibility that I might accept him. He asked, his voice carrying across the silent room, if I would do him the honor of becoming his wife, if I would be brave enough to face society's judgment alongside him, to build a life together despite the obstacles we would undoubtedly encounter. Every eye in the room turned to me, waiting for my response. I was acutely aware of my father standing beside me, of the assembled guests holding their collective breath, of the weight of the moment and the impossibility of what Sebastian was offering. And I realized that Mrs. Dalton had been right. I had been afraid not just of what society might do to Sebastian, but of what happiness might do to me. I had grown so accustomed to my role as the cursed outcast that I had almost convinced myself it was safer to remain there than to risk reaching for something better. But standing in that drawing room, watching the man I loved stake his entire future on the hope that I might accept him, I understood with perfect clarity that some risks were worth taking, that love required courage, and that I had finally found mine. I crossed the room toward Sebastian, my heart pounding, barely aware of the guests watching our every move. When I reached him, I took his hands in mine and told him, in a voice that carried despite my nervousness, that yes, I would marry him, that I loved him with an intensity that frightened me, but that I was finally brave enough to embrace rather than flee from that fear. The smile that transformed his face was radiant. He pulled me into an embrace that was decidedly improper for such a public setting, and I heard several gasps from the assembled guests. But I found I did not care about propriety or scandal or what anyone thought. For the first time in my life, I was choosing happiness over safety, love over fear, possibility over resignation, and it felt like finally breathing after years of holding my breath. When we finally separated, I became aware that the room had erupted into a mixture of reactions. Some guests were applauding, genuinely moved by the romance of Sebastian's declaration and my acceptance. Others looked scandalized, already calculating how quickly they could depart and spread gossip about the shocking scene they had witnessed. A few appeared thoughtful, perhaps reconsidering their own assumptions about curses and reputations. Lady Hartwell approached us with an expression of warm approval. She congratulated Sebastian on his choice, told me that she looked forward to welcoming me into society as the Countess Ashford, and declared that anyone with sense could see we were admirably suited. Her public endorsement was significant. As one of society's most respected matrons, her opinion carried considerable weight. Others followed her lead, offering congratulations that ranged from genuinely warm to carefully neutral. I understood that many were reserving judgment, waiting to see how society at large would respond to Sebastian's defiant stance before fully committing their support. But there were also those who departed immediately, making their disapproval clear through pointed silence and hasty exits. I recognized that Sebastian's declaration had forced people to choose sides, and not everyone would choose ours. My father approached us with eyes that looked suspiciously bright. He embraced Sebastian with genuine warmth, welcoming him to our small family, and told me that my mother would have been proud to see me finally claiming the happiness I deserved. As the gathering gradually dispersed and the drawing room emptied, Sebastian and I finally found ourselves alone. He took both my hands in his, and asked me if I understood what I had just agreed to, that the path ahead would not be easy, that we would face opposition and judgment, that some doors would close to us because of our choice to defy convention. I told him I understood perfectly, that I had spent my entire life being constrained by others' fears and superstitions, and that I was finished allowing those limitations to define my existence, that whatever challenges we faced, we would face them together. He kissed me then, with a tenderness that spoke of promises and possibilities and futures we would build together, despite society's objections. And standing there in that drawing room, where he had just risked everything for me, I felt the weight I had carried for 23 years finally beginning to lift. I was no longer the cursed daughter, the girl marked by storm, the woman defined by others' irrational fears. I was simply Eliza, a woman who had found love in unexpected places, who had discovered courage she had not known she possessed, and who was finally brave enough to write her own story, rather than accepting the narrative society had imposed upon her. The whispers would not stop immediately. The rumors would persist, There would be challenges and obstacles and moments when we questioned our choices, but we would face all of it together, and that made all the difference. The weeks that followed Sebastian's dramatic declaration passed in a whirlwind of activity that left me simultaneously exhilarated and overwhelmed. Wedding preparations, even for a ceremony we intended to keep relatively modest, required attention to countless details I had never imagined needing to consider. Mrs. Dalton threw herself into the planning with an enthusiasm that suggested she had been waiting my entire life for precisely this opportunity. My father, characteristically practical, focused on the legal arrangements and settlements, ensuring that everything was properly documented. He and Sebastian developed an easy rapport, bonding over shared interests in scientific inquiry and philosophical debate. I would often find them in the library at Ashford Manor, which had become my second home during the engagement period, engaged in animated discussions about everything from agricultural innovations to the nature of consciousness. Society's response to our engagement proved as complicated as Sebastian had predicted. Lady Hartwell's endorsement had provided some legitimacy, and several other influential families followed her lead in accepting the match. But there were also notable absences, invitations that did not arrive, social gatherings we were pointedly excluded from, cutting remarks disguised as concern for Sebastian's well-being. Lady Pemberton, unsurprisingly, made herself scarce. I heard through the social network that existed even in my limited circles that she had retreated to her country estate, claiming ill health, though most suspected she was simply avoiding the embarrassment of facing Sebastian and me after her daughter's deception had been exposed. Miss Caroline had apparently been sent to stay with relatives in Scotland, removed from London society until the scandal died down. I found I could not muster much sympathy for their predicament. They had attempted to destroy my chance at happiness through calculated manipulation, and while I took no pleasure in their social disgrace, neither did I regret the consequences of their own actions. What surprised me most during this period was discovering how many people had been waiting for someone to challenge the superstitious narratives that governed so much of society's thinking. Several families approached us, quietly, often through intermediaries, to share their own stories of being persecuted by rumor and irrational belief. A widow whose late husband had died in an accident, leaving her blamed for his death. A scholar whose unconventional theories had led to accusations of heresy. A young woman born with a birthmark that some claimed indicated demonic influence. These people found in Sebastian's public defense of me a kind of permission to speak their own truths, to reject the labels that had been imposed upon them. It was humbling and profound to realize that our story had become larger than just the two of us, that it represented a challenge to the fear-based thinking that had constrained so many lives. Sebastian threw himself into this role with passionate determination. He wrote letters to newspapers, arguing against superstitious persecution. He used his influence to support others who faced similar accusations. He became, somewhat to his own surprise, an advocate for rational thought and compassionate treatment of those society deemed different or dangerous. I watched him with a mixture of pride and love that sometimes felt almost overwhelming. This man, who had once fled England to escape his family's blame, had transformed into someone who stood firm against society's judgment, not just for himself, but for others who lacked his resources and influence. Our wedding day arrived with autumn in full glory, the trees ablaze with color, the air crisp and clean, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed to mock any suggestion of ill omens. We had chosen to marry in the small chapel on the Ashford estate, rather than in London, preferring intimacy to spectacle. The guest list was small but meaningful. My father and Mrs. Dalton, of course, along with Lady Hartwell, and a select group of friends and family members who had genuinely supported our union. Notably absent were the society figures who had made their disapproval clear, and I found their absence a relief rather than a disappointment. As I stood in my chamber that morning, Mrs. Dalton helping me into the simple but elegant dress we had chosen, I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror. I looked different than I had just months ago, not in any physical way I could precisely identify, but in some fundamental quality of expression. There was a confidence in my eyes that had not been there before, a peace that came from finally accepting that I deserved happiness rather than merely surviving its absence. Mrs. Dalton noticed me studying my reflection and came to stand beside me. She told me, her voice thick with emotion, that my mother would have been so proud to see me on this day, that she had always known I would find my way to happiness if I could just be brave enough to reach for it. I embraced her, this woman who had been more mother to me than servant, and thanked her for never allowing me to accept society's assessment of my worth, for reminding me, again and again, that I was more than the circumstances of my birth. The walk from the manor to the chapel felt both surreal and perfectly natural. My father accompanied me, his hand steady on my arm, his expression radiating quiet joy. The path was lined with late-blooming roses that Sebastian had apparently planted specifically for this occasion, a detail that made my heart swell with affection for his thoughtfulness. And then I saw him, standing at the altar in the small stone chapel, and everything else faded to insignificance. Sebastian watched me approach with an expression of such open adoration that I felt tears prick at my eyes. There was no guardedness in him now, no careful control of emotion. He looked at me as though I were the most precious thing in his world, and I understood with perfect clarity that he felt exactly what I felt, this overwhelming sense of having found something rare and irreplaceable. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion and ancient words and promises that felt both terrifyingly permanent and absolutely right. When Sebastian slipped the ring onto my finger, I felt as though something fundamental had shifted in the universe, as though I had finally stepped into a life I was always meant to inhabit, but had been too afraid to claim. The vicar pronounced us married, and Sebastian kissed me with a tenderness that suggested he still could not quite believe I was real, that I had chosen him despite everything society had thrown at us. The small gathering erupted in genuine applause and cheers. My father embraced us both, his eyes suspiciously bright. Mrs. Dalton wept openly, making no attempt to hide her tears. Lady Hartwell declared it the most romantic wedding she had attended in decades, and several other guests echoed her sentiment. We hosted a modest wedding breakfast in the manor's dining room, and the atmosphere was one of genuine celebration, rather than the forced gaiety that so often characterized society gatherings. People spoke freely, laughed without restraint, and toasted our happiness with sincere warmth. During a quiet moment, Sebastian pulled me aside to a window overlooking the gardens. He told me that he had never imagined feeling this content, this fundamentally at peace with his choices and his life, that I had given him something he had not known he was seeking, permission to define himself by his own values rather than by others' expectations. I told him he had given me the same gift, that he had shown me it was possible to be seen and valued for who I actually was, rather than what circumstances had made me appear to be. That he had taught me courage I had not known I possessed. We stood there together, looking out at the estate that was now as much mine as his, and I felt a profound sense of homecoming. Not just to this place, but to myself, to the woman I had always been, but had been too afraid to fully embody. The months that followed our wedding brought both challenges and unexpected joys. Society remained divided about our match. Some gradually came to accept it, others maintained their disapproval, and a few continued to whisper about curses and ill omens. But Sebastian and I had created our own world within Ashford Manor, a space where superstition had no power, and where we could simply be ourselves without constant vigilance against judgment. We hosted gatherings for scholars and freethinkers, creating a salon of sorts where ideas were valued over social standing. We supported local charities and initiatives that helped those marginalized by society's prejudices. We built a life of purpose and passion and intellectual companionship that felt like the fulfillment of everything I had ever wanted, but never dared hope for. And when thunderstorms rolled across the moors now, we would stand together in the conservatory, that space where so much between us had begun, and watch the lightning split the sky without fear. The storms had become something different for me, no longer a reminder of tragedy and superstition, but a celebration of the tempest that had brought us together, the courage it had required to claim happiness despite society's objections. There came an evening, perhaps 6 months after our wedding, when Sebastian and I sat in the library after dinner, reading companionably in the firelight. A storm was building outside, and I could hear the first drops of rain beginning to tap against the windows. Sebastian looked up from his book and asked me if I was happy, truly, deeply happy, or if there were times when I regretted the path we had chosen. I set down my own book and considered the question seriously. I told him that yes, there were moments when the exclusion from certain social circles stung, when I wondered what our lives might have been like if we had chosen a more conventional path. But those moments were fleeting and insignificant, compared to the profound contentment I felt in building a life alongside him. that I would rather face society's disapproval with him than have its approval without him. He crossed the room to where I sat and pulled me to my feet, holding me close. He told me that he felt the same, that every challenge we faced only reinforced his certainty that marrying me was the best decision he had ever made, that he loved me more each day, which he had not believed possible on our wedding day, when he already felt his heart might burst with the intensity of it. We kissed, and then we simply held each other, listening to the storm intensify outside, and I realized something profound. The curse had never been real. The only thing that had ever constrained me was my own acceptance of others' narratives about who I was and what I deserved. Sebastian had not broken the curse. I had broken it myself, by finally believing I was worthy of love and happiness, by choosing courage over fear, by refusing to allow superstition and judgment to define the boundaries of my existence. The girl born in a storm had been labeled cursed, marked by tragedy, doomed to bring misfortune. But the woman standing in that library, held by a man who loved her fiercely and without reservation, knew the truth. There had never been any darkness in me except what others had projected onto an innocent child unable to defend herself. I was not cursed. I was blessed. Blessed with intelligence and integrity. Blessed with a father who had never believed the rumors. Blessed with friends like Mrs. Dalton who saw past society's labels, and blessed beyond measure with a husband who had recognized in me what I had struggled to recognize in myself. The storms would continue to come, both literal and metaphorical. Society would not suddenly transform into a bastion of rationality and compassion. There would be challenges ahead. I had no illusions about that. But I had learned something essential. I had the strength to weather any storm, especially when I was not facing it alone. That night, as Sebastian and I retired to our chamber, the storm reached its crescendo. Thunder shook the windows, and lightning illuminated the room in brilliant flashes. I felt no fear, only a wild exhilaration. The storm that had defined my birth and shaped my life had become, in the end, the catalyst for my liberation. I had spent 23 years being acted upon by circumstances and others' perceptions, but I had finally learned to act for myself, to write my own narrative, to define my own worth. The whispers would never entirely cease. Superstition dies hard, and some people would always prefer easy explanations to complex truths. But the whispers no longer had power over me. I had found my voice, my courage, my place in a world that had tried so hard to make me believe I did not belong. I was Eliza Ashford, Countess, wife, scholar, and survivor. I had been called cursed until a count kissed me under a storm. But the truth was simpler and more profound than that romantic narrative suggested. I had always been exactly who I was meant to be. I had simply needed to find someone who could see it, and more importantly, I had needed to see it myself. The storm raged on through the night, but I slept peacefully in my husband's arms, secure in the knowledge that I had finally come home, not to a place, but to myself. And that was the real end of the curse, not in being loved by someone else, but in learning to love and value myself enough to believe I deserved that love in return. The thunder rolled across the moors, and I smiled in my sleep, dreaming of storms and courage, and the extraordinary power of refusing to accept the limitations others try to impose upon us. I had been born in a tempest, marked by tragedy, labeled by superstition, but I would define myself by none of those things. I would be defined instead by my choices, my courage, and my refusal to let fear write the conclusion to my story. They had called me cursed, but I had learned the truth. The only curse that ever truly binds us is the one we accept for ourselves. And I had finally, triumphantly, gloriously set myself free.